African countries are among the few countries in the world that retained elements of their colonial masters. It's baffling that African leaders fought for their independence, and yet when they got it, they did not see the need to destroy every element of colonialism. These countries retained the languages, systems, and structures, as well as ideals of their former colonial masters. However, the leaders of the Sahel are changing this narrative by removing every remnant of colonialism. In a move that signifies a break from its former colonial master, the leader of Niger launched an initiative to rename the streets, monuments, and public areas bearing French names. This is in a bid to reclaim Niger's national identity and sovereignty. Speaking at the launch of the initiative, the spokesman of General Tiani, Major Colonel Abdrahmane Amadou, stated that most of our avenues, boulevards, and streets bear names that are simply reminders of the suffering and bullying our people endured during the ordeal of colonization. This is why the administration decided to launch the campaign to change the situation. One of the streets that was renamed was a street in Niger's capital called Avenue Charles de Gaulle. It's baffling why the previous president never saw the need to rename this street when it's a known fact that Charles de Gaulle was the brain behind Francafrique, which has kept Francophone Africa in bondage. Thankfully, at the renaming ceremony, the street was renamed to Avenue Jibo Bakari in honor of the Nigerian politician who played a key role in Niger's struggle for independence. Another place that was given a facelift was a stone monument that had an engraving of French colonial officer and explorer Parfait Louis Montet. His image has now been replaced by a plaque with a portrait of Burkina Faso's iconic revolutionary leader, Thomas Sankara, a charismatic Pan-Africanist who was assassinated in 1987. Niger's decision to replace French colonial remnants clearly reflects the current movement in Africa to assert independence, not just politically, but also culturally and historically. Interestingly, in recent times, Burkina Faso has also taken similar steps. Few months ago, Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Ibrahim Traore, announced that it is changing the country's national anthem, which was originally in English, to the Burkinabe local language. According to the Burkinabe Ministry of National Education, the Burkinabe national anthem has been translated into 14 local Burkinabe languages in order to strengthen patriotic sentiment and shift away from neo-colonial practices. As we stated earlier, when you walk through the streets of any African country that was colonized, one thing that you will definitely find is the remnants of colonization. For Francophone Africa, such as Niger and Burkina Faso, it could be a street named after a French colonial ruler or a statue of one French colonial master. The official language of these countries, which is French, is even the biggest remnant of colonization. All these are all evidence that at one time these African countries were under French rule, and they tried to impose their culture, ideas, and language on the African people. Although Africans resented the domination by France and other Western powers, which led to the struggle for independence which they later attained, some of the remnant colonialism which paid tribute to the colonial masters were left untouched. The most obvious of these are language, and let us say that it has had a profound negative impact on African civilization and development. Before we proceed, this is a reminder for you to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. You see, when the colonial masters landed on African shores, the first step they took to colonize Africans was to somehow convince Africans that their traditions and languages were savages. Then, they began to impose and enforce their ideas and principles on the people. The only way they could successfully do this was by enforcing their language, be it French, Portugal, or English, on the local communities. So began the spread of Western education with the aid of Christian missionaries. They built schools and encouraged Africans to learn these new ideas, not because they were interested in developing the colonies, but because they wanted to impose their ideas and make Africans learn just enough to understand their principles and ideas. If you observe, till today, these schools do not teach Africans what is truly needed to industrialize and develop. Africans were only taught theories, and never the practical knowledge on how to do things. If they actually did, independence would have occurred before 1960, because it was only after World War II, when Africans were used in fighting the war and they interacted with people from other countries, that they began to struggle for independence. Now, in schools, Africans were taught and are still taught to hate their identity, language, customs, and traditions. They were taught that the white man's knowledge was supreme. This is why it was very easy to group local communities that had their own language, customs, and traditions together into a single country. While it was a good move for the colonial master, this can arguably be regarded as the origin of Africa's problem today. Think about it. Every African country in existence today has more than 10 local languages. Nigeria alone has 250 local languages, and each of these languages comes from different ethnic groups with their own beliefs, customs, and traditions. Before the colonial masters came, each of the ethnic groups was divided into kingdoms, and everybody lived by their rules. Of course, there were skirmishes and fights between these kingdoms, but that is normal. However, when the colonial masters came, they decided to lump all these ethnic groups with their different languages and traditions to form a single country. Is it any surprise then that the root cause of violence and insecurity in most African countries can be traced to tribal and ethnic concerns? In Mali, for instance, the violence started in 2013 because of the Tuareg rebels, a tribe in Mali that believes they are marginalized. Today, that violence has spread to other parts of the Sahel because Islamic jihadists took advantage of the situation. In Nigeria, the political scene is not stable because the minority groups feel that only two tribes, which are the Hausas and Yorubas, have been the ones leading the country since independence. This issue of ethnicity and language has created strife and division, making the goal of African unity a dream. If Africa is to get better and have any hope of development, Africa needs to go back to its roots. Africa needs to find its identity and language. Just look at the Asian countries and even Europe. All these countries have their own languages, which is the official language spoken in that country. In Germany, the official language is German. In China, it's Mandarin. In India, it's Hindu. Yet all these countries have different languages as well, just like Africa, but they chose to have a general language that everyone speaks. However, it seems that Africa is the only continent whose official languages are languages imposed by the colonial masters. In African schools, it's considered wrong and a crime to speak your local language. The situation is terrible and is even worse because some of the current generation of young people do not even know how to speak their local language. Everything they know is either English, French, or Portuguese. When will Africa learn? China was very poor before World War II, but after the World War, the leaders decided to take serious measures to develop their country. Guess what? They did it without losing their identity. In Africa, the situation is not the same. Africa needs to follow the steps of China and choose one official language. This is a very necessary step to break free from colonialism. African countries are not the only countries that were colonized. India was colonized by the British, but they didn't lose their identity, language, traditions, and customs. The leaders of the Sahel understand this, and that is why they have taken steps to reclaim the national identities of their countries. It is the reason why the president of Mali, Assimi Goïta, removed French as the official language of the country last year. And just like Niger, Burkina Faso renamed a major street in the capital city of Ouagadougou, which was formerly named after the French colonial-era leader Charles de Gaulle. The street has now been replaced with that of Thomas Sankara, a Pan-Africanist, hero of Burkina Faso and beloved former president. However, the Sahel countries are not the only countries in Africa that have taken steps to decolonize their countries. Similar moves have been made in Ivory Coast and Senegal. In Ivory Coast, former French presidents Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and François Mitterrand are no longer honored by boulevards. Instead, they have been replaced by the first Ivorian president, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, and other local figures. Similarly, in Senegal last year, opposition leader Ousmane Sonko removed Charles de Gaulle's name from an avenue and renamed it Peace Street after becoming mayor of the Ziguinchor district. Other signs bearing the names of French colonial personalities were also replaced. But the fact is that Africa has to go deeper and completely change every aspect of colonialism that stripped it of its identity. Africa needs to reclaim its language, customs, and traditions that have been discarded in favor of that of the West. Things will only begin to change when Africa goes back to its roots. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video.